wandering after break. Right. Hello, everyone. We're going to reconvene the session. And my pleasure to introduce Christian Schneider from Adobe, who is going to give this next talk. Christian.
Yeah, thanks. So, quite a few people coming in. That's nice. So, good afternoon. I'll be talking about testing OSGi applications today. So, let's start with a bit about me. My name is Christian Schneider. I work as a computer scientist at Adobe. I'm also a member and committer at a few Apache projects, mostly around OSGi or integrations. You can also follow me on Twitter or check out my website with a few tutorials about OSGi. So first about testing, just a few days ago, I found an interesting article from Kent Beck about properties of valuable tests. I won't go into details about this, but very interesting to read, and you should also check your tests for if they are like these properties, then it's good. So what I like especially is, of course, tests should be fast because it improves your cycle time. Then they should be readable. I think it's really important that your tests reflect your requirements and don't go into too much detail in their setup and their whole specification. So if you don't understand a test in a few minutes, then it's probably not a good test. Also behavioral, so the tests should reflect your requirements and how the system should behave, not really how it is built, because how is it built, that might change over time and make your test failing or have to be changed. Also important, tests of course should be automated. We want the tests to be run, or at least most of the tests, before every commit. But this is of course all not really OSGi specific. The same for the test pyramid, should also be quite familiar for everyone. With the unit tests on the bottom, integration tests, acceptance tests, and UI tests. And the pyramid should visualize that you want to have as many unit tests as possible, and then less integration, less acceptance, and less UI tests, because they're increasingly complex to write and fragile in their nature. Then for unit tests on OSGi, so that's the real first slide about OSGi. Basically, it's not very different to normal tests. So you use standard JUnit or whatever you prefer. You should look into the OSGi APIs. If you use them too much, it's difficult to make tests for them because it's very difficult to mock OSGi APIs. They have a lot of callbacks and things that happen under the hood, and you want to avoid these. Then, like for any test, even for a unit test, you want to be as black box as possible. If you're depending too much on the interior of your classes, then your test is likely to fail. Apart from that, one thing in OSGi that is very typical, you have some DI framework. This is, for example, with declarative services. You have a component, your class is set up with this, then you have injections of services, maybe also of other things, like here a Jaxares context. These things are something that are not easy to set up with plain Java. So how do you do that? And there is a working solution, and it's not really OSGi specific. I really like Mockito for that, because it can easily inject such private fields into your test. And this is how it works in practice. You say you want to use the Mockito JUnit runner, then you use the @mock annotation on your injections. this makes a mock object for these, and you use inject mocks on your class under test, and Mockito takes care of injecting those mocks into your class, and of course you have to then provide the behavior on the mocks. But as long as this is not really OSGi APIs, it's just your normal code, it's reasonably easy, hopefully, depends on your code, to get your tests working. Next thing is about integration tests. So the unit tests basically run outside the OSGi framework normally. So I would not really try to use an OSGi framework on that. That's too low level. And but at a certain point, you will need to validate that your OSGi setup works, like your bundle has the correct imports, exports, and your components have the right annotations, so they are coming up inside OSGi. So at the integration test level, you typically want to come up with a OSGi framework and see how your tests behave inside OSGi. So, of course, you want some setup to start your framework. You, again, want to be as black box as possible. And here it's on the level of typically OSGi services. So you don't want to go deep into your code. You want to use them from the outside, from the services your bundle provides, because that is the natural way other bundles interact with your code. And of course, you want to have a minimal environment to make your tests really fast. On the other hand, you might also want it to be as realistic as possible, but these things, of course, contradict a bit. So let's see what we have on the integration test side. There are quite a few frameworks we can choose from. It depends a lot on how you set up your application. So if you design your application using the BND tool style with a BND run file to define what to start up, how to configure it, then you likely will choose the BND testing framework. If you rather use a setup that is completely different or use karaf features, then PAXExam is very suitable because it has the karaf container, which can start a real karaf system with every feature that you define and all the out-of-the-box features. And either if you don't use karaf or if you want to do a very narrow test that just tests your bundle and whatever it needs directly, then PAXExam with the plain OSGi container is very suitable. And we can see in the following slides what advantages and disadvantages each has. So let's first start with the BND testing. You define your application via the BND run file, and this file you will also use for your testing, or a separate testing BND run that typically refers to the main BND run. Basically, you set up your application to come up, and then you add your code to be your test code, and you add a test runner from BND testing, and that's all. So your application is still very near to how it will work in production, and still it comes up pretty fast. So these tests, of course, depends on your application. If your application takes half an hour to come up, then the test can't be faster. But if your application is very small, such a test can easily run in less than a second or half a second. It's also nice that these tests run in process, so you can just use Eclipse or IntelliJ. I don't think IntelliJ has a runner. Probably you need Eclipse to really have IDE support for running the tests. There you can just start the test with the BND test runner, and it looks like debugging a normal Java application. So there is no remote debugging or complicated setup. On the downside, you don't have a lot of features to inject services or set up configuration in a special way. Basically, you can only use the plain OSGi APIs like Service Tracker to get your services. I will show a small tweak that I just built that makes it a bit easier. but it's less support from the framework. The other downside is it needs a special runner, so you can't just use Surefire or run as JUnit test. This will not work. So you need for the IDE some support, and for Maven there is just a plugin, so that's not such a big problem. But it might interfere with your whole setup of analyzing the tests, maybe. So it's a bit special. And the other special thing is that even the specialists in the BND testing tell me you should place your tests in source main Java because they need to be built into a jar, and this jar needs to be deployed. You can do it in source test Java, but then you have to set up Maven to build a jar from your test code so you can deploy it in the BND run. So it's a bit of a special system, but it is basically the only thing you can use if you go the BND run setup way for your application. If you don't, then BND testing cannot be used. Now the other problem with BND testing, from basically what it provides itself, is this is the code you need to inject a service. So I guess this is a bit small, but I can explain it. So you use the framework util get bundle to get a bundle. It's what you can always use from the outside of the OSGi framework. Then you create a service tracker for your service, and you open it, you wait for a service, and then you got the service, and in the end you even have to close it. So it's a bit some code that I at least do not want to have in my tests. So I experimented a bit how to make it easier, and I created a rule for JUnit. I call it service rule, that basically abstract all that away. So you just use the rule, new service rule with add rule, and in your tests you simply say service require and your service interface, and it will look up the service, wait for it, time out after some time. So this makes it a lot easier in your code. I asked if there is some library already prepared to do this. Unfortunately, there is not, but maybe I can help to bring something up in the next BND version. So on the other side, there is PAXExam, which is used basically for everything that is not really a BND tool setup. Unfortunately, PAXExam has no module or container to bring up a BND run based application. So unfortunately, this doesn't work if you use a BND run file. But if you use karaf or another way to set up your bundles, this works fine. The way in PAXExam is you use run with PAXExam. So the good thing is this runs with standard JUnit. You don't need special support in your IDE. It also works from the standard Surefire Maven plugin, so your build is very normal with this. With the add configuration, you define how to bring up your framework. You can either define all the bundles or use the karaf setup, like tell it what features to load, which karaf version to load, and then when you want to use your services, it has a really easy way. Just uses add inject, and this means PAXExam will inject your service. You can also define timeouts, and you define a filter with LDAP syntax for the OSGi service. So this is really convenient. Yeah, it can also work in process or forked. So whenever possible, you should work in process, but sometimes it doesn't work well. Then you switch to forked, and this covers normally these cases. But fork means you need remote debugging if you want to debug into your code. So whenever possible, you should try with in-process. And yeah, these tests run inside OSGi. So basically, your test will be deployed into the running framework and called either in-process or via RMI to talk to your OSGi framework. Then in plain OSGi, it looks like this. So you define typically Maven bundle with group ID, artifact ID. You can also use version, or what is better is to use version as in project. You need another Maven plugin to make this work. Then it basically exports all the versions of your Maven dependencies. and you do not have to repeat the version inside your at configuration, because this could diverge from what you set in Maven, and that's not a good idea. And one other thing that I found recently is you can use bundle reference file target classes. This allows you to run directly without building a jar. And it allows that you don't need to run your Maven build to create your jar. You can just directly from Eclipse start your test when you do changes in your code, and it instantly works. So this is a very fast way. These tests are normally even a bit faster than the B&D testing, but as you see, if you specify each Maven bundle, it's a bit more effort to set it all up. So yes, so this is very good if you just need a few bundles. If you want to bring up your whole application and the application is big, then it might be too much effort to specify each bundle individually. But in that case, probably you have some other way of bringing up your application anyway. And the typical way is using Apache Karaf, where you define features for your application. And you have also a lot of built-in features for almost every project you can use in OSGi. So for example, the JAX-RS whiteboard has 2 features, one for the main thing, one for the Jackson support, and you just can use these this feature definition, say where is their repo and the features to load. You say which karaf version to load, and that's all. So your whole application can come up like this. The good thing is it's starting the real karaf. So if you run in karaf later, it's very near to your production setup, but it's always remote, and this means you have to use remote debugging when you want to look into your application. Good thing is that the karaf features allow to easily define even big applications. So this is really tested for bigger setups, but it is a lot slower than the other variants. If you start karaf, that's always between 5 and 10 seconds just to make it come up. But you have a way to at least say only bring up karaf once per module, and then you can run all the tests on this one karaf without restarting it all the time. So I have a link to example code where you can look up how this really works all in practice. Then the last part are the system tests. From the highest level of tests I'm looking into, I am not really covering the UI tests because I'm not really experienced in UI tests, so I would not tell good things probably. So from the system test side, you are really going black box. Really, you're not even inside the framework. Your test typically runs, your test is in your Java process, in your test runner process, but then your application runs in a separate process. And if you need infrastructure, a good thing is to use Docker for all your infrastructure. I'm not sure if I have a slide about it, but I'll talk a bit about testcontainer framework, which is very suitable for bringing up your infrastructure. So one other thing that is important for tests, so nowadays a lot of things are done with REST. So how does REST work inside OSGi? There is this JAX-RS whiteboard specification from the OSGi Alliance, and it defines how to bring up a server, but it also defines how to bring up a JAX-RS client. So when you run your tests with PAXExam, you can also use a JAX-RS client. It's pretty simple. You just have to inject the client builder as a OSGi service instead of bringing it up by hand. And then from the client builder, you can use the usual way of build and target and request get. For example, this is a service that lists a few tasks, and with a get request, you get all those tasks. So you get a response. You can, from the response, also get your entity object. So this is all kind of easy, but there is one general problem when you test REST services. when you start your process with the application, you never know when it's fully finished. So how do you make sure that this operation works? If you're too fast, your operation will fail. If you're putting a delay there, then you never know, is the delay long enough, or is it maybe much too long and I lose time all the time for tests? So there must be some better solution for that, and luckily there is. Maybe a good question to the audience. Who knows already the framework Availability? So 2, huh? So it's good. Maybe I have something new for you. That's good. So Availability is just a small library that allows repeating operations. So it's not special for REST. It can be used for everything where you're not sure that the first call already works, but you know that after a few tries, it should work. So this is exactly what Availability covers. So you use availability.await, or if you import it directly await, then you can specify how long it might retry. If you leave it out, I think it's 10 seconds by default. You can also specify if it should ignore the exceptions while retrying, because at the start you typically get exceptions and normally you would maybe log them, but if you expect these exceptions at the start and they are not a bad case, then you can simply ignore them, and still Availability will wait until the time is over, and if in the end there is still an exception, it will always throw this exception, so you will cover it with your normal test behavior. And then in the until, you specify what should happen. So you simply create a closure, for example here, target.request.get, and you also tell it when is it good. Of course, when an exception happens, it repeats, but you can also say a null value is also something that is saying that it's not yet done. So here I say repeat until target get is not a null value. This is a Helmcrest matcher, and in the end, if it succeeds, you get the response like normally in the output. So this is a very comfortable way to repeat something that you know that it should work after some time. And you can use this outside OSGi and also inside OSGi. In the example code, there is also, you can also see how to do this. You need to install Availability and Helmcrest into your OSGi runtime. Then it can be used easily. So, yeah, I have a slide, that's good. So the other thing is test containers. Again, to the audience who already knows test containers. Well, it's good. So some more to that you maybe take away from that talk. Test containers is again something that is not limited to OSGi, but works very well together with OSGi testings. It is a framework that allows to spawn Docker containers, but also has special Java classes for well-known things like databases or Redis or messaging systems. And the main thing it does is it brings up the container via Docker. And if your test fails in any way, it also safely brings down the containers. Because if you just start Docker from your application and the application has an error that makes the whole process fail, then it often happens that these Docker containers keep running. And if this happens on your Jenkins server, your admin of the Jenkins server might not be happy when these pile up. Or even a running Docker image from one run might disturb another run. So it is very nice that with test containers, this is all covered. You just define, for example, this is for a standard Docker, whatever. New generic container, you tell it the Docker ID and which ports it should expose, and that's it. You can then use it, and in the end, it will automatically be brought down. And with the special setup or special APIs from test containers, you will also, for example, get a client. So it can bring up containers with a dynamic port, so you don't have to specifically reserve a port. And then you can say get client or something, and you get the client for this special thing like a messaging system that you can directly use without taking care of which port to select, which port the Docker container exposed. So that's basically all from the slides. I can also look into the examples a bit because we have a bit time left. You can also look into the examples yourselves. It's in the OSGi best practices example. I started these with my other talk that is on Thursday about how to build an application, and I just added the tests to this same example because you need something to test anyway. And if you follow me on Twitter or look here, I will, after the talk, post the slides and also the link to the examples. So much for the slides. Now we can look a bit into the actual code. So this best practices application has first a parent. That's something that's that you can make very convenient. This is a bit about the best practices too. I found that you can define most things already in the parent, like SLF4J API. Every bundle, every module that you have should use that. Maybe you want to use JSON or REST. You can put these APIs here, also the basic OSGi APIs. And you can also put your test dependencies directly here, which makes your individual modules a lot smaller. Then I also define here the BND Maven plugin and the jar plugin. So this creates the manifest for OSGi. This puts it into your jar. And you can also use the BND baseline plugin to have semantic versioning support out of the box. I will explain a bit more about that in the other talk. And these are the modules. So there is a backend. The app is where it's all assembled, and the UI is a JavaScript UI that is deployed into OSGi, so you have both together. And exam tests is the test with PAXExam, and the BND tests are inside the app. So that we can look into the we can look inside the PAXExam tests. They're here. Often you use something like such a base class where I define the whole setup. Like here I define that I want to use the karaf minimal distribution with a certain version, the karaf standard repository, the RSJXRS repository, and this is the configuration that you need for PAXExam. So you tell it which karaf to load. You can also optionally use a debug configuration for remote debugging. And for karaf 427, you also need to define this variable. I think this is a bug in karaf normally, or in exam. This should be set up for you normally, but this helps. Keep runtime folder is also very interesting. If you specify this in the karaf container, then after the test, it leaves the whole karaf there. And you can just cd into the directory and start karaf by hand. It's the full karaf like you would normally start it. And then you can use the command line of karaf to look into your application, see why maybe something is not resolved or if services are coming up, because karaf has a very nice command line, and you can use this to find out what's wrong with your application. Apart from that, this is how a volatility is set up. Just have to go there. So basically it's just loading these two bundles, Hemcrest and volatility, and you define the versions in the POM. Yeah, apart from that, yeah, this is how a simple test looks. So here you also find the exam reactor strategy. This helps to bring up karaf only once per your whole module. If you do it on every test, then you will have this overhead of starting karaf only once. And then basically you inject your services you want, you delegate to the one base configuration, and inside your tests you can simply use your services. But you always have to remember that your test runs inside OSGi, so this is not your normal JUnit. And this is the full test that shows how to use REST tests in OSGi, which is also not so easy if you do it the first time, and also how to use a utility. So this is basically how to get the client builder, and this is how to combine it with a utility to make sure your test comes up reliably. And these tests you can directly run with a JUnit test. As you see, it takes a bit until karaf comes up, and then the test should succeed. So yeah, these tests succeeded. And let's now look into the B&D testing. So here you see how such a test looks. This is the plain test without the rule. As you see, there is no run with. This is the good thing. It's a very simple JUnit test, but you can't run it with JUnit. If you do, you get such an error because of this assertion. You have to run it with this test launcher. So you're a bit dependent, I think, on Eclipse here. And this is the simplified test with a service rule. And there you, of course, you just can require the service. And if you're interested, this is how the service rule looks. So basically, it just, when you call require, it opens the service tracker and it uses the statement of the rule to bring down all the service trackers when the test ends. So you don't have to take care of that. Yep, so that's all. I hope I'm good in time. So,
yeah, we have time.
Do you have questions?
Time for another question or two?
I actually don't have any question. I just wanted to have one small remark. That when you talked about the speed testing, it's actually the B&D wheelchair testing, the way you showed it right now. There's another framework in B&D called Launchpad.
Yes, this is new, I think.
Yeah, it's pretty new.
It's in beta now. Yeah.
All the things that are shown, the cool features that are shown in the PAXExam, like this add injectors, new annotation there called absolutes.
Yes, yes.
So everything, it has its own runner.
Actually, initially I wanted to show it, but the problem is it requires that you use the B&D workspace. So I use the Maven way of, you have a standard Maven workflow or Maven build, and for this Maven build, the Launchpad does not work. So if you use the workspace, it's a great solution, I think, yes. Yeah, it's a good remark.
Yeah.
You also had something?
It was basically the same thing.
All right. Yeah, yeah.
Also include Launchpad in page or future one.
Yes, yes. So I'm not experienced with the workspace, so I would not be able to present it in a good way. So if you have good experience with that, maybe would be a good talk. Maybe until the next conference, it's also ready for everyone to use. At the moment, I think it's just in a better state. Yeah, thanks. Any more?
Thank you very much, Christian.